Hello, everyone.
This event is being recorded, so if you do not want to appear on camera, please turn off your camera. First and foremost, we'd like to make the acknowledgement of the land known as New York City, but originally known as Lenapehoking, the land of the Lenape, which today serves as the material catalytic for our virtual Zoom space. We have reason to believe that we are being joined by individuals across the Americas and would furthermore like to acknowledge these as lands that have suffered the consequences of colonization. My name is Colton Lee, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Afro and Indigenous Futures series of events, which is hosted by the Liberal Studies Student Association at the New School. This is my fellow co-moderator.
Hello, my name is Jose Luna. This project consists of inviting scholars, activists, and artists to talk about a diverse array of topics necessary to be worked on in order to construct an imagining of the future. A key idea of this project is that Indigenous and Afro concerns are crucial to be discussed in order to tackle existential threats in the context of the Anthropocene and imagine the possibility of a future. We'd like to begin mentioning the overarching purpose of this conversation, which is to delve on how art can engender liberating ways of knowing, imagining, and ultimately producing the world, and to think about the role of Indigenous scientific literacies in this endeavor. This event will be divided in two parts. The first hour, we'll ask as many questions that we have prepared to our invitees, as many as we can for the hour. After they have finished, we'll open the floor for 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question for the speakers, please type it in the chat, preceded with a Q, so the moderators can identify them in the chat. The background moderators have asked that you wait until the Q&A portion to send your questions.
Thank you, Jose. Now, we'd like to present our invitees, Grace Dillon and Suzanne Kite. Grace L. Dillon, Anishinaabe, is professor of the Indigenous Nations Studies Department in the School of Gender, Race, and Nations, and also affiliated professor at the English and Women, Gender, and Sexualities departments at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. She is a senior co-editor of the upcoming Routledge Handbook of Co-Futurisms, which includes intersectional views of diverse futurisms, and the editor of Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. Kite, aka Suzanne Kite, is an Oglala Lakota performance artist, visual artist, and composer raised in Southern California. She is currently a PhD candidate at Concordia University, a research assistant for the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, and a 2019 Trudeau Scholar. Her research is concerned with contemporary Lakota ontologies through research creation, computational media, and performance practice. Without further ado, let us begin. Grace, in your book, Walking the Clouds, you write, all forms of Indigenous futurisms are narratives of Biskabiang, an Anishinaabe Mauen word connoting the process of returning to ourselves, which involves discovering how personally one is affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt in our post-native apocalypse world. This process is often called decolonization, and as Linda Tuhiwa Smith explains, it requires changing rather than imitating Euro-Western concepts. In this vein, and to start this conversation, we'd like to ask you, how can the concept of knowledge production in art and science change if it is engaged with Indigenous worldviews?
Anin, I see the light You and to everyone who is here. Thank you very much, Colton, for that question. There's, uh, as I've been thinking about this more, first of all, in our Anishinaabe language, both science and art are considered together. We don't separate a scientist from an artist from a writer. And very wording has that kind of connotation. The thing that really has been grabbing our attention lately with a lot of the latest Indigenous Futurism stories, books, novels, films, video games, graphic novels, 3D, multimedia art, and I'm sure Suzanne could speak more to that, is also an interest in our Biskabiang. When I grew up as a little one, before it became the term used for decolonization, what it literally meant for us was returning to the woods. And returning to the woods was just a very natural thing for us. We grew our any kind of crops, our three sisters and other things by the edge of the forest. And so returning to the woods was returning to the knowledges of whose trap lines existed where, and other kinds of forms. But decolonizing lately for us has become, how do you decolonize the Anthropocene? Because we're not just in a native post-apocalypse kind of moment, Anthropocene, and how do we decolonize that? And so I'm going to borrow first from Potawatomi scholar, activist, and climatologist Kyle Powys White, who has written so beautifully about this. And he gives 3 points, and then I'll respond with my own thoughts. He suggests that there's these 3 key items that suggest distinct approaches to inquiries into climate change. And speaking of change with art and science, we do need to offer change. We do need to suggest our Indigenous worldviews. And one of them, the first one he suggests, is that the anthropogenic or human caused climate change is simply an intensification of environmental change imposed on Indigenous peoples by colonialism. And that, of course, can be true for BIPOC members of the community and so many others, not just Indigenous people. But it's the intensification of environmental change that has been imposed upon us already, since Indigenous people also are the first ones affected around the world. There have been a number of scientific studies to suggest that our viewpoints do become important in that sense. His second point that he brings up is that we need to renew Indigenous knowledges, such as traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous keepers, what I call Indigenous sciences after Gregory Kahete, and that can bring together Indigenous communities to strengthen their own self-determined planning for climate change. And the third one for him is that Indigenous peoples often imagine climate change futures from their perspectives as societies with deep collective histories of having to be well organized to adapt to environmental change, and B, as societies who must reckon with the disruptions of historic and ongoing practices of colonialism capitalism and industrialization. So the fact that our thinking is Anishinaabe thinking anti-capitalist. We did not live in that kind of way. And even when I was growing up, we chose not to live in that kind of way. We had co-ops. We shared together. We had land back movements even back then, even as we are having them now. And we were, of course, anti-colonialist as well. And so I was just thinking about this question that you were proposing, and I was thinking, why is Indigenous Futurisms needed to us, to niche people, is not giving up on our earth and our inhabitants. Resilience is knowing that these dark periods in human person histories occur and seem to be the end of the world, but in fact, a few will survive. Resilience is knowing that those few will increase in numbers and will move into a state of survivance. And survivance is Gerald Visner's term for when you've had experiences of domination, victimry, and tragedy, that you overgo those moments by presenting stories, by presenting narratives, by presenting art and sciences that overgo that kind of sense and give you a sense of celebration. So this is well past the desperate life survival mode, Oni, that heals, art that heals, song and dance that heals, and science is an action that heals Mother Earth and all our kin in the common pot. And Indigenous science in that sense is that very thing. It's a high context where you have singing and art and ceremony and dances and music and drumming and song, and all of that is part of our sciences. This power of resilience is partly based on knowing the stories and histories of the past, is partly encouraged by the foreknowledge that Mino Bima Diziwan, living the good life, will come into being with patience, endurance, and coming together as strongly united communities. Yet, our power of resilience also comes from of what we call Oshtigawen Anakawagadawan, which is to have our head in the clouds. And our other expression is not just simply to have our head in the clouds, but more so, Oshnish Gishtigawan Bitawanakawad. That's to have anyone's head, his, her, my, your, it's gender neutral, head between the clouds. And when you have your head between the clouds, that's when you are truly imagining and bringing in this art and science together as the confluence. And so our daily moments of having our heads come from the clouds in better times that are implemented in the now, something that we're doing currently as well. Always conscious of our contemporary times and fusing as inendumoan, that's our word for an imagination that is not soon forgotten and is implemented in a genuine fashion, but urgently at times when needed. Fusing imagination tied to will, tied to getting things done, even on a small scale, that provides an exemplar for other communities, nations, corporations, exchanges on the internet, and international organizations to explore also with. So we're interested in not providing just simply for our communities, but being allies and really helping Mitsukumikwa, Mother Earth. Underlying many Indigenous futurisms art, writing, is this power of resilience and the necessary impulse for restoration. This restoration is not a complete return to the imagined former days. Rather, these traditions, half glimpsed, partially unknowable as elders die, and certain forms of knowledge are passed along in uneven symmetries. For instance, I have my clan is the Makwa clan from Bay Mills Nation. And so he's in his late 80s, and he is an Anishinaabe artist that creates detailed porcupine quill baskets, in extreme, tight, small detail. And that is a knowledge that he's trying to pass on to others, and they can do the simpler stages of it, but they're not able to do the more complicated kind of weaves that he is doing himself. So that's where, that's just an example of where we may lose partial knowledge, but then we can also have it restored. So this restoration that's half glimpsed is passed along in uneven symmetries. This restoration, in fact, becomes dynamic. And that's our real meaning of tradition, is dynamism and change itself. And the willingness to adapt and change and experience new ways of bringing our heads in the clouds, where one may stay in that condition and never float back to earth and an immediate community, to having moments of our heads from the clouds where we survey Mitsukumikwa, Mother Earth, from above, below, around, and finally in, always in, and conscious of moving from these imaginative vision dream, experientially lived, to a stronger, more powerful sense of how to implement measures that ensure living the good life for as many as possible in our world. Thus, Indigenous Futurisms is not only about community, but about being communitist, a community unified into ceremonial forms of activism that heal the deeply embedded wounds of our Mother Earth, as we are all imbricated in having embedded these wounds.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Grace. That's a lot to think about. I want to give the floor over to Suzanne now. Suzanne, what are your thoughts, response to anything that has been brought up or discussed so far?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be in a Zoom with Grace. So I'm just so excited to be here. I'll start by saying Hamataki Api, Suzanne Kite Api Kishto. Los Angeles Amataha, Nalahama Muskogee Creek Reservation, also known as Tulsa, Oklahoma, Elwati. And Oglala Hamacha, Oglala Lakota. Chante Washte Nape. Chante Washtea Nape Chayuzapo. I shake your hands with a happy heart. So many thoughts came to mind when I was thinking about this question, and especially with listening to Grace's response. And I've been really thinking about the mechanics of the future lately. I mean, Grace's work actually really helped me move away from a focus on dystopias, and as the only imagining of the future I had exposure to, also helped me let go of the concept of that we only have, that the present is so horrible that we must linger in it and not let our minds imagine elsewhere. And I've been thinking about the things that, when we talk about, I guess when working through methods like Linda Tahiwai Smith's suggests in storytelling and songwriting and in listening, listening becomes like the mechanic for the future for me. So as an artist, a sound artist, and a who makes a lot of work with futuristic technologies, they're not from the future, they're from now. But what I consider in trying to understand the future from a Lakota perspective as best I can, from my perspective, I see that our technologies help me understand that it's only through the interaction with non-human beings can I form new knowledge of the world. In my understanding as a human being, I'm pitiful. I reach towards Creator for guidance, and to the non-human, seen and unseen non-human world to understand how to go about creating the future in a good way, how to think about 7 generations ahead in a good way. And in order to do that, I see this like scheme of where understanding the non-human beings help guide us to that future creates our ontologies, creates who we know as a being and who is not. And then from there, I can see that they're and my non-human kin create new knowledge and create the future in ethical ways. And then I can see how I can go forward from there. So it's trying to understand the building of a future from a root place, that first I must acknowledge the unknowable non-humans. First I must understand that it's like not only the land but the cosmos that the future comes through. So a lot of my thinking now is about the cycles of the cosmos that are suggested in the structures that we designed to live in as people. So an idea, one of the concepts that I'm considering a lot lately is how we moved to our different sacred sites, which were volcanic eruptions around the Black Hills, in alignment with constellations throughout the year. And this is what's called the Capemni, and that's what our Sundance is about. That's what our the way we live is about. It's the recreation of the cosmos, and as humans, we must do that in order to create the future. We must continually understand the macro and the micro cycles of the world. And to me, this always reminds me that we don't have to reinvent anything. There's no, and sadly, I don't really want to change what's already here, because we already have good ways, and these ways don't need to be they don't need to be we don't need to manipulate what's already here in order to tap into them. And so I've been thinking a lot alongside Sadie Redwing's work, who's a Lakota designer. Also been in conversation with another Lakota designer, Bobby Joe Smith, and talking about how our people already designed systems for ecology and for ecology and for working through daily life, this macro and micro, in order to secure 7 generations ahead continually. So in that way, I'm always reminded that art and science, the way we have done it for millennia, is that, for particular, our songs, Grace mentioned our songs do healing, they do action. So even these things that seem metaphorical, like putting down tobacco, and you take something that is the absolute micro action that implies the macro action in the universe, that all things must be reciprocal in order to be maintained, and that we must go through these cycles and do our songs and do our dances in order to assure the next year. And I think that is one of the dangers of, and that's come out of anthropology, is saying that these things are not real, they're metaphors. They don't do real actions in the world. When they do, they absolutely ensure that it's not that we don't think that the sun won't come up next year because of it, but we may not be there to greet the sun if we do not do our good ways. So, and I think the final thing I was thinking about a lot this week is what the similarities are between stars and stones. And I say stones because most of my research has to do with artificial intelligence and how stones are connected to us as human beings and what they say to us. And I was thinking about extreme timescales in conversation with this artist and elder and geologist, John Dwayne Gozencenter, who's family somehow related somehow. And he was telling me, it reminded me that when you greet a stone, it really does, it took that stone 500 million years to form, and it's come and it's greeting you in the present, and it will continue to be here for possibly billions of years. And this action in slow, this implication of extremely slow time is what carries us into the future. And I think about stars and stones in this way. They're extremely old, and our experience of them, even for a moment, is extremely important and implies futurity.
That is really, really thoughtful. And it reminded me of yesterday's talk together with our sibling organization, NSP2, about well, not precisely with yesterday's conversation, but with a theme that is current now in academia, this idea of panpsychism. But anyhow, let us continue to the next question. Both of your works engage with what can be broadly defined as science. Grace, you have researched science fiction written by indigenous authors, and Suzanne, you have your artistic practice. In your artistic practice, you have explored the ethical contributions that indigenous knowledges can make to the development of scientific initiatives like AI. The existence of indigenous scientific literacies makes it clear that the construction of the Euro-Western notion of science is necessary in order to imagine and implement new solutions to the issues that are plaguing the planet. From your positionality, what is science and what is art? And what do you think is a prominent trait of Lakota and Anishinaabe worldviews that makes them differ from hegemonic scientific practices? And well, maybe Grace, we can go with you first.
I can go first if you want me to.
Yes, please.
Sure. So this is one of the most important authors I like to read when I'm thinking about science and art is the introduction to Linda T.H. Smith's Decolonizing Methodologies. And when I'm currently trying to hash this out in terms of why indigenous methodologies and arts-based methodologies or research creation methodologies are work together very well. And that's I've been thinking a lot about how our people make new knowledge, and like I said before, I'm imagining new knowledge being created as this kernel of this transformative kernel that happens at the end of a long series of protocols and processes. But the beginning of that being the listening to of the non-human beings. So super far out on the edges of our perception and listening to the unknowable, listening to non-human beings, listening to human beings, and then kind of the transformative process of that powerful knowledge and to the decision making by humans to make something in the world. And so one really great example of this is making a lot of it's very interesting to me how my people make things to wear, and everything should be used. Our art does not have the same exact meaning as in Western Europe, and art is to be has many purposes. And one of the really interesting things, so I was in conversation with my Aunt Becky Redbow, and she was describing to me that she has a vision about a design, and then she takes those, and those are like geometric women's style designs. They're designs often made by women in the community or people who do women's work. And she has this vision, and then she makes a pouch to hold a sacred stone. And there's a couple crazy things happening here. One of which is the transformation of this pouch, which is made of non-human beings. It's made of hides and quills and things like that. It requires first the perception, a message from the unknowable, from that which is sacred, and then it skips verbal language and goes straight into our Lakota semiotic language. So the designs are translatable, and what's happening here is it's the formation of new knowledge that comes from elsewhere and then appears on this amalgamation in human hands of non-human beings. And so then the pouch itself becomes a holder of knowledge of a non-human being, a stone, and it becomes this object that you in conversation with and through. And so that is where I see this intersection and total disintegration of science and art, because how are we making new knowledge here, and how does this simple pouch imply, and it's now it has a role within a healing ceremony which does real things in the world, and its role in this ceremony is maybe a small part at some point. Maybe it'll become a larger part in a later point, but that is how all of these conversations with the human and non-human world collapse into a human action, science or art or what have you. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Grace. If we could have your next question, please go along.
Jose, are you speaking to me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. First of all, Suzanne, boy, did I really love what you've been bringing up all along. And when you were talking about your fascination with stones and grandfather stones, and then the reflection of the micro and the macrocosmos, I was really struck by, we just did this in my NES Indigenous Climate Justice and Environmental Justice course, is a graphic novel called Moonshot. It's the Indigenous Comics Collection, and it's volume 3, edited by Elizabeth LaPensée and Michael Sheashe. And the very final one is called Billow, and beautifully illustrates what you were talking about. It's Billow by David Alexander Robertson, and it's illustrated by Maria Wolf Lopez, who just does so many beautiful, beautiful drawings for Indigenous comics and elsewhere. And in it, the scenes are of the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, the 7 sisters. And they're actually a reflection of the grandfather stones that this person is in ceremony with. He's doing ceremony by himself and needs to cleanse and purify himself. And so you have whether the microcosm is the seven sisters and the macrocosm is the grandfather stones, or whether it's the opposite, or whether they become equal in relationship, they are shining reflections of each other. And yeah, Suzanne, just like you, I grew up where my dad would take me into the woods, and I could tell by the ending of the word whether it was a being that was alive or a being that was not alive. So it wasn't just like all rocks are living beings, although that could be a possibility. But he would show me certain ones, give them names, and some of them would be not living and others would be living. And as a little girl, I was very skeptical and questioning the mystery and the spirit. And now I don't. I've seen too much, but at the time I was like, well, wait a minute. That boulder that was just named as alive, and now I know its word for that particular rock, well, that looks like that could come crashing down on us. Is that what makes it alive? And so when I was very little, I would be asking childlike questions like this, and, and of course, he would not answer, right? He would not explain away, or he would just let me think what I was thinking. And then as I went along in ceremony, I developed very, very different impressions of what that meant. But like you were saying, a pouch can not only be sacred, but be very much a living being. The birch bark or the makwa porcupine quill box that I mentioned is very much alive. The birch bark canoe that my dad and I would make together to go out to go ricing for Manunum, for our wild rice on the shores. That was viewed as very much alive for us as we were taking part in it. And I was thinking of how this happens not only for Anishinaabe and Lakota, but for so many other indigenous nations as well, such as the Oktru Glacier in southern Siberia. That's a sacred site for the indigenous and self-sufficient Altai people. As an elder Oleg speaks of it, it is the troublesome lack of respect for the spirits, or bosses as they call them, of these sacred places by tourists. In addition to the physical impact, the visitor's insolence leaves a heavy spiritual imprint on the land. When they leave, it is the local people who must deal with the consequences of their actions. This includes local shamans carrying out traditional ceremonies to restore the balance between local mountains and Altai. Ultimately, Oleg concludes climate change is a symptom of people's ignorant actions upsetting the natural balance of life on Mitsukumekwa, Mother Earth. And that reflects a lot of what you were saying, Suzanne, where we're the ones that it is important that we bring about the healing. Our word for illness or plague or disease is actually a'akosi, which literally means imbalance. And so the idea is to become balanced in life. And when you become balanced in life and you are balanced with the rest of all of our systems in a mutual reciprocity, that is when even the earth will not be a'akosi or ill. In the Altai traditional worldview, all natural things, whether plants or planets, bees or boulders, spiders or spirits, are recognized as conscious living beings, endowed with all the functions, feelings, and follies of a person. For Oleg and his kin, Altai is a breathing and sensuous living entity with which they must keep their relationship in balance if they want to have a good life. If nature is not treated with reverence, reciprocity, respect, and restraint, or Suzanne, as you were saying, being put to good use at all times, not being wasted in any kind of way, the relationship becomes compromised, leading to environmental imbalance such as climate change. This tribal nation and community also relates to the 2012 Indigenous Latinx and Koji peoples indigenous film Gonan Windua, which some of you here may already be familiar with. This is an indigenous futurisms film set in a future where a mamo sends his apprentice, after 9 years of living in a dark cave, to travel outside of the community, and his path leads to the digital panes of glass from leftover cities that still recite their welcome, where he steps closely to them. But Mother Earth, Mitsukumekwa, is again covered with green trees and blue lakes and rivers, along with the strange vanishing of the city peoples and decaying infrastructures of cityscapes due to climate change and renewal. Fragments of ocean shells, and thanks for the reclamation of the mountains, corridors, and ocean coral reefs, while also collecting medicinal plants to take back to his community. This film was explicitly created by the Koji people themselves, and it centers on the sacred mountain Sierra Nevada de Santa Maria, the highest coastal range in the world, which is considered by them as not only the center of the planet, the heart of the world, but also as the origin of all things. Their purpose in creating this film, after such a long period of isolation themselves, where they were actually really not in contact with other peoples, was a charge that they felt to warn all others about the serious impacts of climate change coming and already here. And since then, there have been so many wonderful approaches that have been written, but I'll just mention Omik Richard Leo's Principles of SWOC, an indigenous approach to global crisis, which entails the new Chanolf principles of consent, including sustainability, sharing, and the following of protocols through storytelling. And it's the way I learned all forms of science was through storytelling. We'd be taken out to the woods, and as we were, looking at different plants and learning the different parts of the plants and Kikandasawan in our own forms of wording for Mishkiki, for medicine. It was very important for us to have stories along with that as we were walking along in the bush, as we were having ceremony later on, as sometimes we were just simply having bonfires together. And we would tell these stories and share these stories. And there's a lot of other examples, but I think I'll leave it at that because I don't want to take up too much time here.
Thank you. Thank you. I think before we move on to our session of questions and answers, I have one more question I would like to pose to the both of you. The idea of progress, especially linear progress, in conjunction with the view that nature exists to be extracted, has mobilized the destruction of the planet. A question that we have had in the making of this event is, what does it mean to think about the future in terms other than progress? And on the other hand, given that we have been talking about science and art, what would the role of these fields of production be for humanities and earth beings transit through time? Grace and Suzanne, I think whichever of you would like to answer that first.
I can go first. I think this reminds me of the work that I was really lucky to get to do last year with the Afrofuturist Alicia B. Wormsley, and we were able to organize some workshops for Black and Indigenous futurists to spend some time with Tricia Hersey, the Nat Bishop, and come to rest, and in a really long process we'd like to do where we come to rest together and then dream together, and that's kind of one of the things that I've been trying to prioritize. Is, well, I know really bad at prioritizing rest, so I have totally failure in that regard, but prioritizing dreams, because in this whole process of me asking myself, like, where does art come from, where does song come from, where does it come from, and of course I know the answer, it's from the other world, but one of the clear answers, which Jackson Tuberis told me, was it comes from slow listening, like really slow. And then I realized, more importantly, that it comes from dreams, a waking dream, a sleeping dream. I see them as the same. And in doing so, and in talking, I've learned a great deal about the future and dreaming the future from Afrofuturism. I feel like there's so much there to be shared with Indigenous futurists, and in thinking with in terms of coming to rest in order to dream together. It becomes clear that linear progress is not even it doesn't make any sense, that there's no benefit. I don't it's what I was just reading a little bit of Vine Deloria classics, and in thinking about how the Western concept of manifest destiny is the epistemology of Western Europe requires manifest destiny. It's bound to happen with the logic that does not consider other non-human beings as beings. Nothing can get respect if you can even disrespect one being. And then when you move past that lack of reciprocity, that disrespect, ideas of progress become very different. And I think about that progress as a spiral and not as necessarily a sphere or a circle, because I think we get a little too circular with our Indigenous time metaphors sometimes. It's not a circle where things change and move, and we're allowed to have new technology. We're allowed to build AI. We're allowed to use computers, allowed to make tech art. But there is this macro, micro, spherical spiral of time happening. So that's how I exit the linear progress sort of time.
Grace, please, if you can respond. And you're muted if you're saying anything.
Aha. Okay. Sorry. Takes a little while. First of all, I was really blown away with what Suzanne was talking about, and just love the thinking that is going on there. There's a new book that we were just reading in my course called The Red Deal: Indigenous Action to Save Our Earth by the Red Nation. And it's wonderful because it brings in not only Indigenous thinking, but it brings in aspects of what would be strongly connected to Afrofuturism and African futurisms, where it's also dealing with the difficulties of incarceration, racial injustice, and the other kinds of things that we have going on. And one thing that they were talking about is that the human problem of the species, where you decide to keep things in the ground. And I bring this up because at COP26, there was just a huge discussion about this and about Indigenous nations actually using their land, to go ahead and have a kind of carbon banking. And my worry and a lot of our worries, as many of our tribal members speak about that, is that just seems to be yet another method of extractivism that has been going on for so long. We've had extractivism, then Australian First Nations peoples decide to go back on that land. Or we've had so many of our nations that uranium was mined without any kind of safety conditions. Nuclear explosions, were taking place by the military within our areas. So many different kinds of forms of colonial extractivism has been a part of our legacy. And so this talks about how this geological age of the fossil fuel economy, or the Anthropocene, misses the point. A select few are hoarding the life rafts while also shooting holes in a sinking ship. Class hatred is warranted. The immiseration of billions sustains the gilded lives of the few. The upper 1/10 of humanity is responsible for half of the carbon emissions from consumption. Half of humanity only accounts for 1/10 of those emissions. The richest 1% similarly emit 175 times more CO2 than the poorest Hondurans, Mozambicans, or Rwandans. 26 billionaires hoard half the world's social wealth, and the world's 2,153 billionaires possess more social wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. Numbers that appear to get more extreme as CO2 concentrations rise. We have to draw lines of separation between us and them because they have already done so. And it goes on from there. But what I want to return to, Butler, Andrea Hairston, has said about her Afrofuturisms, that she is an impossibility specialist. That is, that Octavia Butler was already writing about climate change well before other people were, in her Parable of the Sower, Parable of Talents, and so on. And that in spite of that feeling of impossibility, to be an impossibility specialist is to be able to imagine. And as Suzanne was just speaking of, most importantly, that comes from dreaming. And for us, we have two hearts in our older forms of our language of Anishinaabe. And the first heart is where normally everyone's is located. But our second heart is on the front part of the left part of the forehead. And that is the area that is considered the area of dreaming and prophecy. And once you dream, for us, dreaming comes into being. That's engender. You think it, you dream it, it comes into being. So it's very, very powerful that way. And so, for instance, you have Wayne Blair, who's Australian First Nation, in his TV series Clever Man, where Indigenous Futurisms is centered with a centering of Indigenous communities, their hardships and celebrations foremost in the narrative. So even as they are being collected and being imprisoned and being essentially thrown away in some ways in this particular culture, as the series goes on, the mix of hard science and technology and ancestral ways that are scientific in nature is something that was explained to me by Wayne when I met him in Amsterdam at Other Futures a number of years ago. And the idea is to recenter Indigenous science. In Nalo Hawkinson's novel, The New Moon's Arms, it illustrates that dynamism of an ever-adapting tradition of a Maroon and Taino grandmother who shares her ancestral scientific knowledge while also excitedly learning from the sciences that her grandson is exploring in school. In our tradition growing up, I was taught as a little one that we are ever changing and dynamic as the Baguan, water, streams, lakes, and oceans, that we are drifting in a slow but ever-changing pace. And it reminds me so much of what Suzanne just talked about, where you slow down and you take the time to do so. Isabelle Stinger, as a French scientist, actually adapted a lot of these ideas, and there's now an English translation of her book called Slow Science and the interest in slowing down science. And we've already talked about the high context that Gregory Kahete brings up. And here's just a quick example. Alexis Wright and her Swan book, she's a member of the Wainini Nation of the Northern Highlands of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Her book is set in a highly dystopic future where Aborigines, and that's the expression used there instead of Australian First Nations, are either packed into detention camps or finally bussed and trucked into a far away in swamp, where tribal nations, the Australian government has, in this instance, in the future, given them their sovereignty, but the land is completely desolated. And so these tribal nations hide away, but the army finds them and they practice with bombs in their area and drag in rusted, unusable boats, plastic debris, and other garbage that's been floating in a nearby ocean, and deposit that all in this First Nation swamp, which has become inundated with toxicity. So this same army flies over every night with huge beams of light to ensure that these terrorists, as our silent young girl protagonist is assured by her Irish auntie Belladonna, anyone who is brown is automatically termed a terrorist. These young first Australians are remaining in their place, both physically and metaphorically. The novel draws upon the black swans that alight in the swamp and the journey this young girl takes who has been found in an old sacred tree. Indigenous knowledge or science is founded on a body of practical environmental knowledge that has been learned and transformed over generations of a people through a form of environmental and cultural education that is unique to the people. And in Anishinaabe Wobgeshig's Rice's novel, Moon of the Crust, unusual dark and cold winter that comes along with an at first curious but soon deadly loss of both communication and power with no outside help. Soon the realization that the world itself may have gone dark frames the novel. Fortunately, their own skills created by generations of Geek and Dasawan, or ways of knowledge in trapping, fishing, and gathering and harvesting and growing what they can, become important elements in survival. A distinct return to ceremonial practices also enhances their success in getting through this turmoil. Quote, as it smoldered into ash, the scent weakened, giving way to the strong smell of wood smoke, now woven into the jackets and sweaters of the men and women in the crowd, unquote. As the community resumed sacred ceremonies and gatherings to discuss and share what needs to be done and how to justly share with everyone, including those who have become ill or are so elderly that they need assistance. It is this sense of community and mutual reciprocity for all human beings, animal and plant nations, water protection, grandfather rocks, etc., that helps them get through truly tough times. And they, in that sense, it also fits with Ambeline Kwayamolina of the Palaku people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia, in reference to Suzanne's comment about AI. There she has young and quickly growing in wisdom generations, whether they're human person, wolf person, machine person, angel person, and so on. All of these cultivate and share their experience and stories while interacting and shape-shifting, sometimes quite literally, with animal and plant nations. And so I think these stories that can be perceived as impossibility specialists in some kind of way, when you take, as Helen Hegg Brown from the Chakotay Nation has said, when you take fiction out of science fiction, that's Indigenous Futurisms, and that's the way Suzanne has been talking as well, is that it's not made up, it's not fictional in our minds. It's very, very real. That we will be Gakina Wiwe, that we will be all related together and all tied together in this enterprise healing Mitsukumikwa, our Mother Earth.
Thank you. Thank you. Now moving on to our session of questions and answers. If you have any, please raise your hand or leave them in the chat, but we can jump right into it because we've already begun to get some questions. The first question is, Suzanne mentioned the art song comes from not only the other world, but deep and slow listening. How can we learn to listen to non-human and non-beings in a world that is so verbal and textual, based on that has very narrow definitions of what sound and voice are? and is listening in and of itself another form of art or making?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think that I have no idea how one learns this. I'm not very good at it. I think it's this lifetime or many lifetimes process of learning. I definitely see that some people are better at it than others. I'd say elders know the most and can exercise this with great patience. I think that from my perspective and, my family's relationship with stone altars, that my answers would be, how does the stone gather wisdom over a billion years? And it's in its flow in a way, like stones are still fluid objects. They're flowing, but extremely, extremely, extremely slowly. And I don't think listening is an art form in itself in the kind of structure that I'm thinking of, but it's the beginning of a long set of protocol, a long process of making. It begins with turning one's ear, physical ear or metaphysical ear, towards the unknown.
Grace, would you like to speak to that at all?
I'm first of all just so struck by the beauty of Suzanne's answer and the idea that over billions and billions of years, there is a flow and there is a reshaping of stone and rock. And the idea is of what I was taught when I was little is that we are all star people and our language is heavily allegorical and heavily figurative, and that can mean a lot of things. But part of it is that we ourselves, in that sense, are located on a star, and as at least our body, not our mind, body, spirit, our mind, body, spirit will go on past the entry of the Milky Way. And I have this in mind as my own dad is dying, and we just recently had he had a dream that we all needed to return home. And so we listened to that, and we all came home to our tribal lands, and we had ceremonies there. Through those ceremonies, I agree again with Suzanne that listening is something that requires great, great patience. The last novel that was written by Anishinaabe, Richard Wagamese, and it wasn't quite finished, is a very beautiful novel about just that, where you just have these scenes of spending long, long periods of time barely moving and just listening. And we have 27 acres out here in the mountains, hence our difficult internet connection. And I have had many moments of interactions with mountain lions, several of them, with mountain lynx that have even had little ones under our deck because they felt comfortable. Moments of communion, birthing her little one right in front of us. And I wonder if part of the listening is also the quietness of your body gestures and the way you look, the way you pose yourself, And I think actually of Leslie Marmon Silko's memoir, Turquoise Ledge, which I really love very, very much. And she talks there about being more in a desert kind of situation, and the way, the time that she really takes, and also not just rudely going up to an animal person and trying to touch them or interact with them, like just, quietly being a part of that. And if they choose to come up to you, then you'll know that there's an important conversation that they want to have with you. I had an elk do that at one point. That was just amazing. And I was working on my doctoral dissertation and really in a slump about what I wanted to write. And that elk talked with me. He spoke and I listened. And after that, I just felt like my spirit was free to write. I was unblocked. And I was able to write down more of the kind of radicalized ideas that seem radical in an imperialist and a capitalistic system, but seem very natural for us in an anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist kind of system.
Thank you. I want to remind anyone and everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat or raise your hand. But considering our time is coming close to an end of us together, while we wait on any more questions, I wanted to give the floor to you, Grace, and you, Suzanne, for any final words, but any plugs, anything you'd like to recommend us in terms of your art or pieces of writing, or other people's art or writing or knowledge that we can be directed to for us to learn more.
Okay, Suzanne, you go first, and then I'll. I'm pulling out some new stuff right here.
Yeah, sure. So there's a few things I can recommend. There is the Indigenous AI position paper, which is full of really interesting provocations and considerations for the future of this technology. I can also recommend an interview I did with my grandfather, I think the year before last, called "It's Not Done Through Our Mind, It's Done Through Our Spirit," which is about listening in particular. And I'll link that as well. And I think in terms of, well, hard to recommend artworks when they're not up. If anyone's in Winnipeg, there's some really good artworks up at Plugin, Dana Danger and Asiniac. And I guess the other big thing is I am working on a show with the Vera List Center at the New School, which will be up in New York on December. The performance opening is December 4th, a Saturday. And that'll have all my new work from coming out of my PhD kind of congealed into a show. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Grace, what about you?
Oh, well, first of all, I was just really struck by the beautiful technique that Suzanne is doing with her doctorate, which more and more Indigenous people around the world, I've served on a lot of doctoral dissertations for Indigenous Futurisms, and it's a beautiful combination of where you express your art or you express your story, and then you also provide an analysis, so that your doctoral dissertation isn't just simply this scholarly analysis of something. And I feel that that in itself is a very decolonizing kind of form that is becoming more and more popular. So I'm very thrilled and can hardly wait to see Suzanne's when it's finished. There are so many exciting things that have come out for Indigenous Futurisms all over the place. One book that I'd like to recommend after Scottle Martinez's as an Earth Guardian and Earth Rising Up for Climate, which he wrote between the ages of 16 and 19. But there's a new book that just came out this year within the past couple months by Michaela Stith, Machastith. And it's called Whelp, Climate Change, and it's called Whelp, Climate Change and Arctic Identities. And what is really beautiful about this is that she is, as an Alaskan, she is both African American and has other kinds of ancestries. But she works strongly with climate justice communities that are Indigenous, and spent a lot of time with the Sami people and then just all over the Arctic. And I would just highly recommend this book. It just had students read through this and they were just absolutely wowed by it. And they're all Indigenous. They're all from different tribal nations. A novel that's just come out that's Hawaiian native and set in the future by J.M. Ferreira, Ferreira, and it's simply called Colors, a Novel. And this too just came out just recently and is just an amazing book. It brings in race relations, it brings in Native Hawaiian empowerment. It talks about a cultural decline in a near future Hawaii. And it speaks of homelessness, of living on a beach, of coping with economic hardships, of what a place that a lot of tourists consider to be a paradise. But even with all of that, and even with a medical crisis that threatens to anchor her to her ohana forever, she is able to work through that in the kinds of ways that I think Suzanne has most powerfully spoken about. And so this is a very, very beautiful story. If you're interested in Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction, Joshua Whitehead is just amazing. He's done all kinds of things by himself, but his latest collection is called Love After, and is in reference to the Anthropocene, Love After the End, an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction. It's edited by him and written by many. Every story I ended up loving, and it's just a very beautiful collection that, in spite of all of there's a reality to it, but in spite of all of that, there's also hope. And that's going back to that impossibility specialist kind of thinking. There have been many graphic novels that have come out that are Indigenous Futurisms. I referenced Moonshot Volume 3, but there's also a collection called This Place, 150 Years Retold. That's a very beautiful collection. And then another collection with people like Tommy Orange and Luis Alberto Herrera and Elif Shafak is a collection of stories with images and illustrations, and it's simply called 2040 AD. And then there was through Grist with Tori Strong, I and many others were helping him with what was, let's see, climate 2200. So the year 2200, and what climate justice and environmental justice would look at that point. And one thing that I have noticed in speaking, especially with Indigenous communities, that we are less likely to want to just jet off into space and find another planet, that we are far more interested in healing and restoring and rebalancing Mitsukumikwa itself. And so that has been kind of a standout feature.
Before we all leave, I wanted to make sure to mention to register for the NSPDOS event, Imagined Lunar Communities, Hope, Habitation, and Humanity, on November 19th, which Grace will participate in. NSPDOS is the New School Policy, NSPDOS is the New School Policy and Design for Outer Space. They are the sister organization to both the Liberal Studies Student Association and the Afro and Indigenous Futures series. So make sure to support. And in closing, I wanted to thank my co-organizers for this event, in particular, Jose Luna and Silvana Alvarez Basto. I wanted to thank our speakers, Suzanne Kite and Grace Dillon. Thank you very much for all of your presence. And yeah, thank you all for attending our event, and we hope you enjoyed it. We will send everyone the recording in the coming days, and be well, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. This conversation has been gives a lot to think about, and we hope to see you again in the following events that are going to happen from the Afro and Indigenous Futures series of events.